Welcome to Wizards of the Tower.
Roleplay.
If I was to say Crom, what would you think about?
Crom lives in the sky, and he would be very upset with me if I didn't die a magnificent death with a sword in my hand.
And who is he associated with?
Usually Robert E. Howard's Conan.
Right.
Right.
But where does the term barbarian come from?
Well, if you're asking me as a history nerd, I can really go off, on that. But typically, in a general sense, a barbarian was someone who existed outside the realm of civilization. It doesn't mean that they were uncivilized. They just existed outside the realm of the popular civilization at that time, the Greeks and Romans. So if they were just someone who existed outside of the borders of Rome.
Right. You weren't as civilized as we are, so therefore, and you don't talk like us.
Yeah. And so the Romans thought that barbarians, their language kind of sounded like the barking of dogs, like bar, 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 that kind of thing. It wasn't smooth and eloquent like Latin or Greek. And so that's what that term sort of comes from. And it's kind of stuck with, people through all these years, that anyone who's considered to be crude and uncultured, kind of backward in their ways is like a barbarian, an uncultured barbarian.
Yeah, and then into the Christian side of it, who saw that the Vikings were barbaric.
Yeah, barbaric, and barbaric is violent and cruel and uncivilized, and they do these heathen rites, and they worship weird gods, and they make sacrifices, and that's what barbarians do, all this stuff like that. And of course, in the Christian era, you have Christianity, which is civilization and learning and this kind of pious belief in a single deity. On the outside, you have these barbarians, these heathens, who had a multi, group of gods. They were these various gods, and they did sacrifice, and they went to war, and they evoked their gods when they went to war, that kind of thing.
They were savage. They would brutalize you.
Brutal, violent. And so the popular idea of barbarians are essentially that. All through, the various eras of civilizations and times, we have the kind of the Roman idea of a barbarian. And of course, that's carried all the way up until, like, one of the most popular ideas of a barbarian, and that's from Robert E. Howard's Conan.
Right. Conan is the epitome of what Gygax was trying to create.
Yeah.
When he created, one, Dungeons and Dragons, he was a huge Robert E. Howard fan.
Exactly.
And two, when the Barbarian Class finally came along, he was looking at Conan in the barbarian sense. Now, Conan wasn't always really a barbarian. He was a freebooter. He was a buccaneer. He was an usurper.
Yeah, he did all sorts of various things. He was basically, as long as the coin was right, he would fight for you. But if the coin was wrong, well, he'd be out the door. He's a freebooter. He was beholden to no one. I think, Howard wanted to have this concept that he was just someone who, basically lived by his wits, lived by his sword, lived by, his strength and intuitiveness and survivability. And that's kind of how he, approached life. Wine, women, and song, and lots of fighting and that sort of thing.
Right. And then we get into the next one was Fritz Lieber's Fafhrd. From Fafhrd and Grey Mouser.
And Fafhrd was a northern barbarian.
He was northern. He was from the wastes of the north, and he had the Winter Women or the Winter Witches or something like that.
Yeah.
But he was this big, tall, strong, strapping young lad who fought, wore furs, and was from an uncivilized area of Neowyn.
Yeah.
But wanted to go visit Lenkmar. Plus, he was a bard, but he was most commonly referred to as a barbarian.
Okay. Barbarians, are often seen as fighters and big, hyper-masculine people, but you've got other ones like Brack. the Barbarian, which I've heard the title, but I don't know a whole lot about Brack the Barbarian.
Yeah, Brack the Barbarian, written by the John Jakes.
John Jakes.
John Jakes.
Who typically wrote Civil War books.
Right, in the 1960s,
Yeah.
as I believe, when Brack the Barbarian. I actually read one or two of the Brack the Barbarian, and they're kind of a Conan ripoff. They're kind of fun, but yeah, he was a barbarian.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's ones that some of us grew up on. Thunder! The Barbarian.
You know, introduced a whole new generation to this concept of barbarism, which is pretty weird if you think about it. I mean, most barbarians, when they present, are either really hyper masculine, enormous muscles, or hyper feminine. You know, like these female barbarians. You know, like enormous, powerful legs and thighs, and scantily clad with these enormous swords and axes, and you're like chainmail bikini. You know, that's kind of all the tropes for that. Yeah. You know, they have to appear super strong, super masculine, not masculine, but feminine too, but super strong, very incredibly dexterous, incredibly tough. You know, and they're violent, and they strike out, and they roar when they attack.
They like to drink and burp and
drink, and they're kind of filthy, but yet they have a certain kind of charm to them. You know, kind of like a wild dog kind of charm. You know, and they're clad in leather and furs, and big brass discs all over their chest, and they have
horn helmets,
and big bracers, and they carry enormous swords. But they don't have refined armor. You know, typically it's not like a knight's armor, or even like really, really good chainmail. It's just kind of patched together, maybe made from the hide of some animal. Maybe their helmet was stolen from something, and
maybe
that sort of
chainmail at best.
Yeah, maybe chainmail at best.
And a shield
and another really important concept that we should talk about when it comes to barbarians is the idea that they're illiterate.
Yeah, in fact, in Dungeons and Dragons First Edition, and even when they first came out in the Dragon magazines, they were considered illiterate. They couldn't read and write. They could only speak the language that they had. They had to spend points and to try and learn how to read and write a language. Now, true barbarians, or barbarians that what were called that, the Norse, or even the Germanic people, or even the Celts, had a way of writing.
Oh, sure. I mean, a lot of them.
Well, the Celts not so much writing, but the Germans.
They had runes. I mean, that was their the runic alphabet that came about, and they had their own myths and legends and songs and artwork. And this idea that barbarians are these crude, uncultured people who live in the hinterlands and don't do anything except kill each other and drink themselves senseless and steal or rob or beat you up. Flies in the face of the idea that some of the most amazing artwork ever created, has been created by these other cultures other than Rome, other than Greece, And you get this idea, that's kind of where you get the idea of the Nordic barbarian. Fafard's from the north, Conan's from Cimmeria. You have these other barbarians that are from
Brack was from the
frozen wastes,
Northland.
And then, so there's like this Nordic aspect and the Vikingish aspect of it. And it's really something to think about, because Vikings, are in popular media now. There's the Vikings TV show, several of them.
Valhalla.
Yeah, there's the games that are coming out.
There was
the
Northmen or whatever.
The Northmen.
And then there was that other TV show.
There's the Last Kingdom.
Last Kingdom.
That kind of thing. So they're then again you get the conflict between Christian.
13th Warrior.
The 13th Warrior. You get the conflict between Christian and heathen and that sort of thing. And so. In another idea is that, and you brought this up in Dragon magazine, or even in the first edition of D&D, and this has been shown kind of in popular media with the movie The Northman, and that's about the berserker.
Yes. So the original barbarian was called a berserker, and it came out in Dragon magazine number 3. And then again, they came out with the barbarian in Dragon issue 63, and then Unearthed Arcana, which was first edition Dungeons and Dragons. I think that book came out probably around 81, 82. I can't quite remember off the top of my head.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a long while.
Yeah.
So, the barbarian has been around there.
Yeah.
And the original Barbarian didn't have this rage ability.
Which I think is really, really amazing. And we'll talk about that just a little bit later. But barbarian rage is a concept that everybody seems to think that barbarians, they rage, they're ultra violent, they lose their temper, they attack things. But some typical things about barbarians in D&D and even in the Conan books is that barbarians were completely and totally distrustful of magic.
Yeah, they hated magic. In fact, in the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, barbarians couldn't use magic, a potion or maybe a gem or something like that, maybe later on weapons and armor, but they would try to destroy it.
Yeah, they were antagonistic.
That was part of your experience points was destroying magic items, and associating with a magic user was a no-no.
Yeah.
Which comes from the whole Conan concept.
does.
Conan didn't like magic.
Yeah, a lot of his antagonists were evil wizards, and spells, and he was always kind of fighting these kind of conjurations of dark shapes, and he would always hack them up, that kind of thing, and kill wizards, and they were always up to no good, of course, and that was kind of an anti-magic aspect of it, that they, like Conan preferred the physical world, and everything he could touch and lay his hands on, and he wasn't really concerned so much about magic items or magic beliefs. But another thing, of course, is when it comes down to it, is I remember you telling me that in the first part of D&D, barbarians could only be human.
Yeah. Classes were limited in race, what races could play what, and human was the only one that could be a barbarian.
See, I find that really fascinating. We'll talk about this when we do playing barbarians, but now the concept of a barbarian is that essentially it's anything could be a barbarian, right? Any race can be a barbarian.
I played a gnome barbarian once.
Yeah, I know you did, and I was kind of like, what? But you're playing your character within the bounds of the books, which is fine. Okay, as long as your alignment is like non-good, non-lawful, that sort of thing.
Nowadays, alignment doesn't matter, but in the original first edition, they could be any except for non-lawful.
Yeah.
Because lawful is this strict code that you follow, this law, this code of law.
And so the idea then, I guess, is barbarians would be outside the law.
Yeah.
Right? And
neutral or chaotic.
Yeah, so the idea of an outlaw, meaning that an outlaw is like the worst thing you could possibly be, is that because it is outside the protection and the basic, outside the tenets of the law as it exists. Mm-hmm. Now, even a criminal, even a thief or a murderer is not, and this is an old idea, is not really an outlaw. They're under the protection, so to speak, of the crown, but they're being punished, but yet they're being punished under the auspices of the crown. An outlaw is someone who's been completely exiled, and so anybody can kill them on sight. That kind of thing. So that's the idea that if you play like a barbarian, a non-lawful barbarian, are you an outlaw? Or are you just someone who doesn't exist with, you don't exist within the sense of the law itself, but outside the law?
Right.
And that's a pretty interesting concept when you think about it.
Yeah, and in the whole deal with magic, even clerics, they were kind of fearful of clerics until they got to like second or third level, and then cleric high-level spells, they kind of frowned upon.
Okay.
Now, a shaman was kind of a different. Now, there was a shaman that was thrown up in mentioned in one of those books, which they kind of tied in with, which was kind of a cleric barbarian. But we're not going to hit upon that.
We're not going to hit too much on shaman because we'll do a whole episode on that probably coming up. I have played a barbarian once in Clem, the barbarian. Now, Clem
had one eye.
He had one eye.
He lost an eye in the battle.
Yeah, and so I had an agreement with our DM that Clem would get certain advantages with his axe. He had an enormous axe. That he would get armor advantages and certain advantages because he had one eye, he could never utilize ranged weapons because he had no depth of field.
Yeah.
So he had certain advantages, physical advantages, and advantages with his axe. Now Clem was fun to play. Really fun to play. He was sort of superstitious of people. He was wary of magic users and witches,
I played a witch.
but he was also very respectful of witches because he had seen the power that they can conjure. And he was, like I said, he was superstitious. He believed in magic because he had seen magic take hold of people, and they had done, magic in his village was something real that you saw, and it was something to be feared, and something, most people stayed away from it because you just didn't understand, what it was going on. His idea was, I swing my big axe, I chop, people up, and that's it. And, Clem had trophies of heads that he had chopped off, and he kept them on his belt, and he walked around with heads, and he's like, yeah, look at this guy, this guy chopped up, and that kind of stuff. And people would back away from him, because he was enormous, scarred. He was kind of older. He had a lot, but he was fun to play because essentially he's very, very uncomplicated.
Yeah. Whereas my gnome barbarian that I played just was chaotic as could be.
Yeah.
I mean, she was always getting into trouble and doing things her way, and
see, I see that.
Which was kind of fun because you normally think of this barbarian as all this massive damage, and she didn't do a ton of damage. So it was kind of a whole reversal.
A gnome barbarian. I mean, okay. So let's talk about old school barbarians versus new school barbarians.
Well, so the old school, the berserker, when they first came out, you would charge into battle.
Yeah.
It wasn't this rage, but you would charge into battle, and breaking from a battle, you had to make die rolls.
Right.
To do it. And I kind of look upon that as the old school berserker.
Yeah.
Berserker goes charging in and just starts smashing, and have to bite on their shield to prevent going into rage. Now,
right.
In my own game, in the Wildland campaign, there was a trait that one of our characters got, which was berserk rage. And it's not rage, it's a berserk, and she had to make a saving throw every time it became stressful. Otherwise, she would just flip out and charge into a raging battle.
Right. And a lot of times
which caused some problems at the start.
It can, and a lot of times that doesn't come up correctly in the game.
Yeah.
Just because, I don't know if it kind of gets passed over or doesn't get played right.
Well, she got higher level, and now she can make her saving throws.
See that? Yeah. So you don't fly into this constant rage all the time.
Now she's got her class rage.
Yeah.
Which is, to me, that's kind of a trope that, a barbarian shouldn't really be raging, because a barbarian is what people were. They weren't a class.
Right. It's your civilization.
Right.
Sort of thing. So
a berserker would have been a better name for it.
Right. And that's your old school. Even the idea of like someone biting their shield comes from the chess piece that shows one of the warriors biting down on its shield to keep itself from flying into berserker rage. And the idea of berserk, meaning that they wore a shirt of bear hide instead of armor. And of course, I've heard it mentioned, in certain things that, nothing turns a sword like a thick bear hide, a thick bear fur. It's hard to hack through it. So that, in a sense, that was their armor, and they often took on the aspects of the beast, that they were. And in the old school barbarian, in the first edition, you could take on like lycanthropy.
Well, that was the berserker,
right?
Dragon number 3.
Number 3. Okay,
in Dragon 63 and Unearthed Arcana, there wasn't this rage ability.
Right. Well, the rage ability didn't come around until 3rd edition.
Yeah.
Right. And now, so let's get into that idea of raging. Where in the world, and I know about like berserk fighting, as it's shown in games, but where in the world did they come up with the idea that barbarians have to rage, or that's part of their?
Yeah, that's like they're taking the whole berserker and throwing that whole part into it. So barbarian should really technically be called a berserker, or a berserk.
I mean, a barbarian could just be a fighter.
Yes.
A fighter that doesn't wear armor.
Could even be a ranger.
It could even be a ranger. Why do they have to rage?
Could be a rogue.
Right. Why would they have to rage? Why would that be part of it? Somehow someone got together and they combined those two. They took berserker qualities and they took a fighter and like an unschooled fighter or something like that, combined them into what they thought like a barbarian is.
And technically, I would view rage is if you go into a rage, there's chances of you hitting your party members.
Well, yeah, that's the whole
They're
thing.
close.
It talks about berserkers that there's a percentage chance that if you roll the wrong percentage, you'll start attacking your party members because they can't see, what's going on.
It's just a blind rage.
You're Logan Nine Fingers. You're attacking your friends. You're attacking anybody.
Yeah.
Within until you burn yourself out, you're attacking everybody.
Right.
So Rage didn't come around until 3rd edition. When did the animal totem stuff start coming about?
I think that, I'm not 100% sure. I think that might have started coming around third edition and 4th edition, 5th edition, Pathfinder 2, Pathfinder Revised.
Because I remember when I was looking up stuff for Clem, there was all this beast totem stuff. Mm-hmm. And I just kind of tossed that to the side. And I remember talking to the DM, and I said, I don't want that to be part of his personality. I don't want him to have like a beast totem. He's essentially a fighter.
Every couple of levels, you get this new beast totem. And,
okay,
you're a bear. Now you're a tiger. Now you're a boar. Now you're a wolf. Now you're a eagle. Now you're a whatever.
Yeah, I think when I talked to
now you're a T-Rex.
I think when I talked to the DM about Clem, he let me get away with not having beast totem, and in exchange he let me have an extra point of armor class.
Yeah.
So that I would be more of an unarmored fighter. And Clem just had simple leather armor.
Right. Now old Dungeons and Dragons, the Berserker and the original Barbarian, you were limited in what kind of armor you could wear.
Sure, but also, not to jump in front of you like that, but they also talked about they're proficient with most weapons.
Yes.
And that's really unusual, because a lot of times they say that barbarians can't use complex weapons.
Yeah. Using, a Bectacordon or
something
goes arm,
right?
Or
something like that, because they always try to limit them to like simple weapons, stone weapons, iron weapons, whatever. And like you're saying, armor. They couldn't use certain kinds of armor.
Yeah, using like leather, hide, studded. You couldn't. And if you started wearing bulky or kind of restrictive armor, it would lessen your armor class. You wouldn't get your dex bonuses.
Interesting. You wouldn't get the dex bonuses. Because typically barbarians are seen as having great fortitude. They're meat shields, essentially. Tremendous fortitude. Somewhat dexterous. Somewhat strong. Not a whole lot of int in there.
Yeah.
Supposedly.
And then the Berserker had a lycanthropy ability.
Right.
Now, they couldn't spread lycanthropy, but they would turn into this animal, whether it be a bear or a wolf or a lion or whatever, and they would bite and claw.
While they're berserking, right?
While they're berserking.
Yeah, they had claw attacks, bite attacks, rushing and crushing and hug attack, bear hug, and that kind of stuff. It's really interesting how old school barbarians were shown as opposed to new school barbarians where any race can be a barbarian. Like an elven barbarian? What?
Yeah.
I mean, culturally, it just doesn't make sense to me. And I know a lot of things don't make sense a lot of times in RPGs. While you're in the middle of the desert, one of your characters wants to play a dolphin.
Wants to turn into a tree.
Wants to be a tree. Okay, whatever. But, all right, but I think they just took the whole concept of barbarian. Those of us who love the Conan concept, the old school Conan, even like Brack or Fafford, and all of a sudden there's like gnome barbarians and like
dwarf
barbarians, which is like, what? How would you be outside Dwarven society to be a dwarf barbarian? That just doesn't make any sense. So I'd love to hear what other people have to say, especially folks maybe around my age who think, our popular conception of our barbarism and barbarity, we grew up with Conan. We saw the movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, That really made us think about barbarians.
So here's kind of an interesting thing. When it comes to a barbarian, the barbarian was a class that was added afterwards in the Unearthed Arcana. That's when it became official.
Okay.
And then when 2nd edition came out, it wasn't even a class. You had the barbarian book, which made it a subclass of the fighter.
Ah, okay.
Okay. Then when 3rd edition came out, the barbarian was back. And then when 3.5 came out, the barbarian. When 4th edition came out, it wasn't in The original Player's Handbook, you had to wait for the Player's add-on book.
Okay.
Pathfinder, it was there, first
Yeah,
edition.
yeah.
Second edition, it was there. In the revised Pathfinder, the newest version, 2.1 or whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
it's not in there. It's going to be in the Player's Core 2 that comes out.
Okay.
So it's been relegated to being a frontline character, and then we'll come out with it later, all through these books, which is kind of interesting.
It is. I mean, it's one of those mutable characters that seems to come in and out of. It's kind of like Paladin. You know, it goes in, comes out. They don't have it.
Well, the Paladin, not to break from this, the Paladin is actually in all of the books except for revised. Well, second edition it became a champion. And then in revised edition of Pathfinder, it's not there. It's going to be in the Player Core 2 book.
Gotcha.
So.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, I'd love to hear from people what you think about that. You know, I mean, whether you like it, you don't like it, whether you play barbarians, what you think about them. Let us know. I think it's an interesting concept because they keep cropping up. You know, and there's the barbarian artwork that shows like this little bitty gnome with this enormous giant sword holding onto it, and it's got like a little sneer, like a look at it, and you're like, what is that?
Well, so in my own campaign, the Wildlands are the barbarian cultures. Now, inside of those cultures, you have the barbarian class.
But they're not.
But they're not. They're berserker. I actually call them berserker.
Okay, see, they're berserker, but even they're not really even barbarians.
No.
They're just living in the hinterlands.
Yeah, they're, well,
They
as
use
I call
money. They have education.
Yeah,
They have craft.
Even though we call them as a barbarian in the class core, their real definition in the society is berserker.
Okay. Okay, I know you make that distinction because we have that one berserker character.
Yeah, we have one berserker
Yeah.
in the party. So anyway, you know, that's an uncivilized part of the world, and
True.
that's why they're called barbarians by the Empire.
Gotcha.
They're not called that by the Asaidorians. They're just called Wildlanders because they live
Right, because they live in the wildlands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're going to end this episode of Wizards of the Tower.
Roleplay.
Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, spread the word, ring the bell, make comments. We always reply to every comment, and we hope you like this episode.
Yep.
So anyway, thanks, folks.
Thanks, folks.